This is an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder.
June the 6th will mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the beginning of the Normandy campaign in World War II. Historian David O'Keefe is back on the program to talk about the campaign and some of the events that will help to commemorate the anniversary. David is the author of a couple of books. There is 7 Days in Hell, which talks about the epic story of the men from the Black Watch during a bloody World War II battle, and also One Day in August, the untold story behind Canada's tragedy at Dieppe. In addition to being a history professor, David is also a television producer and documentarian. He joins us via Zoom from right here in Montreal. Hi, David.
Hello, Peter. How are you?
Just tickety-boo. Thanks very much for being on the program with us. This was a battle that was a long time in the planning. How long did it actually take to plan this?
Well, the first time that they started conceiving about coming back to Europe to launch a second front from England was in 1942. The end of 1942 is when they first started looking at it. And then it was 1943, just up the road from Montreal in Quebec City, in the fall of 1943, where they actually give the official go-ahead. And that was for Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of Europe, and its sub-operation, which was known as Operation Neptune, which was the actual invasion of Normandy itself. And that was set to go in May of 1944, but a couple of delays here and there, and it ended up going in on June 6, 1944.
Did weather have anything to do with that?
Well, not initially. A lot of it had to do with planning, because you can imagine you're dealing with a gargantuan effort here. This is not just like a one-day butcher and bolt raid like the Dieppe operation in 1942. This is an amphibious operation, which is the most difficult of all operations to carry out. And when you're going to Europe, it was very much as Eisenhower said, it was going to be a crusade in Europe, which means you need a massive logistical tail. Not only do you have to get across the English Channel without the Germans knowing you're about to hit their shores, but you also have to storm ashore through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. You have to get ashore, stay ashore, build up your bridgehead, break out of that bridgehead, and then liberate all the countries on your way to Berlin. At least that was the plan. So you can imagine, we're talking about 150,000 men who are going to land on D-Day itself. And by the end of it, probably about 500,000 within 90 days are going to be squeezed into this bridgehead, and eventually to break out of Normandy and then liberate France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany.
You mentioned 90 days. I understand that General Bernard Montgomery of the British forces envisioned a 90-day battle. And actually, in the real case, it lasted 2 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. So pretty close to the 90-day situation. How well planned was this as opposed to the execution itself? Did it really go to par?
Well, yeah, it was as well planned as any operation in history or military history could be. I mean, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. There's always going to be a flexibility that is necessary in battle. And certainly that was the case with the Overlord plan that was essentially put into detailed planning by Montgomery. Montgomery was going to be the ground forces commander in Normandy, even though the overall Overlord operation came under Dwight David Eisenhower, the American general who would later be president. It was Montgomery who had to see to the day-to-day fighting. And he and his planners envisioned that they would be able to defeat the Germans in Normandy in 90 days after landing, whenever that landing would come. So by D+90, as they would say in the military, they were going to wrap up the German army. Well, lo and behold, it was D+75 when they actually defeated them. But the paradox is, even though they defeated them almost 2 weeks earlier than planned, this turned out to be a much more costly battle for the Allies than they ever expected. At one point during what we call the Normandy campaign, and a lot of people tend to think that Normandy is just one day, D-Day, June 6th, and as soon as we land and we were able to set up shop, the game was over. Hitler folds up his tent and goes home. That wasn't the case. The German army fought extremely hard, and it was a bitter, bitter battle, even to the point where it was very reminiscent in microcosm of what you would see on the Western Front in World War I. where both armies were engaging in attrition. And the casualty rates were absolutely enormous, particularly when it came to a new type of casualty that, well, not a new type of casualty in war, but a new type of casualty that they were officially recognizing, which was battle fatigue, what we would now know as PTSD. Almost a quarter of all the men who ended up becoming casualties did so because of PTSD.
Wow. Now, they must have known given an idea of the number of casualties, at least on that first day. When they stormed the beaches, there were a lot of casualties. I'm assuming they anticipated that. And how do you anticipate literally sending men to their deaths?
Well, that is the weight of responsibility, the weight of command, and it is very difficult. And certainly, just before D-Day, Eisenhower went down and visited his paratroopers, who were going to drop. As a matter of fact, the plan called for landings on 5 beaches, but on each flank there were going to be drops of 3 airborne divisions, 2 American and 1 British. And as a result, the estimates for casualties for those airborne units was about 50%. So which is like beyond off the charts when it comes to military planning. Usually 10, 20, and 30% would be your maximum. But Eisenhower, when he went down and meet them just a few days before D-Day was launched, he went down and spoke to them personally, and looking in the eyes of each single one of the men that he was talking to, he realized that one out of two were not coming back. And the planners had anticipated this. They anticipated that the Germans would attempt to throw everything they could at them as soon as they landed to try to push them back into the sea. So they had, the Allied planners had prepared for what was called a 2-week dogfight, where they were going to use their preponderance of power in air power and power on the sea to be able to counteract what they expected to be would be panzer-led counterattacks slamming into them within just a few kilometers or a few miles of the beach itself.
You mentioned the sea. This is the largest seaborne invasion in history. I believe 39 Allied divisions were involved?
Well, overall, yeah, there's a little less on the day itself, but by the time you finish with Normandy, yes, you have a massive armada that does come across. And you have to realize that the Allies have been learning lessons about how to do this for the last few years, and actually how not to do this. And that has nothing to do necessarily with the Dieppe operation, but rather the other operations that they put on either in the Pacific against the Japanese or in the Mediterranean against the German forces and Italian forces in Italy. As a matter of fact, the big problem with this amphibious operation, as I mentioned earlier, was getting across, getting on shore, staying on shore. And what they learned in Italy was if you went too inland too far too quickly, like they did at Salerno, you end up stretching out your forces to the point where they almost snap, and the Germans could then easily push you back towards the sea. Or later on, like Anzio, where they were so cautious when they tried to outflank Rome that they didn't move fast enough off the beach, the Germans were able to hem them in. So this is the big challenge for Allied commanders. How far and how fast do they go in the first couple of days in relation to how far can they go with the ability to move everything across by ship? It is extremely difficult. And I think that's why even 80 years later, our mind still boggles at this kind of operation and how actually at the end of D-Day, despite all the casualty predictions and despite the fact that there was some extremely heavy fighting and some heavy casualties, particularly in the Americans, particularly on Omaha Beach, it was a massive success. It was the beginning of the end in the West.
How many countries were involved on the Allied side?
Well, pretty much anybody and everybody in the Allied spectrum had a hand in it. I mean, the principal planners, of course, were the British and the Americans. The Canadians played a big role as well. A lot of people tend to forget that. There were 5 main invasion beaches. There was Omaha and Utah for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and the Canadians had their own beach, Juno Beach. But there was also a French army that would come in. There was a Polish armored division. And eventually there was pretty much anybody and everybody else. Offshore, You have ships from the Norwegian Navy, the Polish Navy, Free French Navy. It really was all hands on deck. And that's why, for instance, when I head over this summer, and I've done this in the past, I take battlefield tours over, largely of American clientele. And you have to paint the picture that this is very much of an allied operation, that everybody is there shoulder to shoulder. It's, in many cases, you could argue it's almost the precursor of the concept of NATO, where everybody is coming together to defeat a common enemy. And that certainly was on display 80 years ago in Normandy.
You teased the idea that you are going to be involved. What are you doing for the 80th anniversary? I assume you will be there.
That is the plan. I am taking a group over, mostly Americans, and we're heading over, and we will be starting in London. And we're going to be looking at the context and the background of the war. And then we are moving up to Bletchley Park, the home of code breaking, which, of course, played such an incredible role, not only in D-Day, but the entire battle for Normandy, and, of course, the entire war. And then we get the chance to go down to Portsmouth and Southampton. This is where the troops did their training and where they embarked for D-Day itself. And then we make our crossing. And we end up going to Normandy, and we'll be there for the official ceremonies on the 6th.
That's a fascinating trip, a fascinating journey. David, I thank you very much for being on the program with us. I mentioned your 2 books, but I know that you're writing a new one.
Oh, yeah. I've got a new one that's coming out next year. It's called Missing Presumed Dead, and it's all about a bomber crew during the Second World War and their pilot who disappears and reappears many years later. The question is, why?
Wow. Will you come back on the program and talk to us about that when it comes out?
I will be happy to, Peter.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David, for being on the program with us once again.
My pleasure, Peter. Thank you.
Military historian David O'Keefe, author of 7 Days in Hell and also 1 Day in August, the untold story behind Canada's tragedy at Dieppe. You can go to my website at thestuffile.com, check out the show number for this program, which is show number 0771, and you'll find links to either Amazon.com or Amazon.ca, where you can order David's books directly. And if military history interests you, then you can go back into the Stuff File archives and listen to previous conversations we've had with David from shows number 0630, number 0221, and number 0157.
You've just heard an exclusive excerpt from the Stuph File Program with Peter Anthony Holder. To hear any or all of the full hour-long shows, visit thestufffile.com. Stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H. That's thestufffile.com. A presentation of Flying Fish Communications.